They say a child's silence can bury a home, but her truth can burn it to the ground. In the heart of a quiet village, young Lwazi stood trembling before her father Themba, her voice cutting through the evening air as she revealed a secret no daughter should ever carry. Gasps filled the compound for what she exposed about her mother. Nomsa would shatter everything they knew. If this moment already grips your heart, tell us in the comments, would you speak the truth or protect your family? In the rolling hills of KwaZulu-Natal, where the red earth clung stubbornly to bare feet and the wind carried whispers of ancestors, there stood a modest compound that many in the village admired. It belonged to Themba, a man known not for wealth, but for his dignity. They said of him, "A man who has little but walks like he owns the sun is richer than kings." Themba rose before the first rooster crowed. Each morning he walked the long dusty road to the fields, his hands rough from years of honest labor. Yet when he returned home at dusk, his face always softened at the sight of his family. To him, his home was not built of mud walls and thatched roofs, but of love, trust, and sacrifice. His wife Nomsa was once the pride of that home. Nomsa had beauty that turned heads even in silence. Her skin glowed like polished mahogany under the sun, and her eyes carried a quiet fire. When she walked through the marketplace, women would greet her with admiration, and men would lower their voices out of respect. But as the elders often warned, beauty that listens too closely to praise begins to forget gratitude. In the early years of their marriage, Nomsa laughed easily. She would sit outside in the evenings, braiding her daughter's hair while telling stories of her youth. The compound would echo with warmth, and even the neighbors would say, "That is a home blessed by peace." At the center of it all was Lwazi. Lwazi was not loud, nor was she the kind of child who demanded attention. But her eyes, those sharp, searching eyes, missed nothing. She watched the way her father wiped sweat from his brow before greeting them with a smile. She watched the way her mother sometimes stared beyond the hills, as though longing for something the village could not give. At first, the changes in Nomsa were as subtle as a shift in the wind. She began to complain softly at first. "Themba," she would say. One evening, her voice tired. "Have you ever thought of leaving this place? There is more to life than dust and struggle." Themba would chuckle, gently shaking his head. "And what more do we need, Nomsa? We have peace. We have each other." But Nomsa would not smile the way she used to. Soon her complaints grew sharper. She spoke of women in the nearby town who wore fine fabrics and gold bracelets. She spoke of houses with painted walls and shining floors. And each time she spoke, there was a hunger in her voice, a hunger that Themba did not fully understand. Lwazi, however, noticed everything. She noticed how her mother began to leave the compound more often, claiming she had errands at the market. She noticed how she would return with small items that did not match their simple life. New scarves, unfamiliar perfumes. When asked, Nomsa would brush it off. It is nothing, she would say quickly. "Just things I traded for," but something in her tone had changed. It was no longer warm. It was guarded. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in deep orange, Lwazi sat quietly outside, pretending to play with a piece of string. Her mother passed by adjusting her headscarf, her steps unusually hurried. "Where are you going?" Mama Lwazi asked softly. Nomsa paused for just a moment, too brief for most to notice. "To the market," she replied, avoiding her daughter's gaze. But Lwazi had already seen it. The hesitation, the flicker of something hidden, and in that moment a quiet seed of suspicion took root in her young heart. For in every village, there comes a time when the wind changes direction, and only those who listen closely can hear the storm before it arrives. They say temptation does not knock loudly, it slips in like a shadow at dusk unnoticed, until it has already taken a seat in your home. In the nearby town, where the roads were smoother and the air carried the scent of ambition, there lived a man named Sibusiso. He was everything the village was not: polished, wealthy, and commanding attention without effort. His clothes were always crisp, his shoes untouched by dust, and his laughter carried the confidence of a man who had never been told no. Sibusiso traded in goods that passed through many hands: textiles, imported items, and sometimes things people did not speak of openly. But what he truly traded in was influence. He knew how to look at a person and see their weakness, and more importantly, how to use it. It was on one of Nomsa's visits to the market that their paths first crossed. She had gone there as she always claimed to buy to sell to pass time. But that day, she lingered longer than usual, her eyes drawn to the stalls that displayed fine fabrics and shining jewelry she could not afford. Her fingers brushed against a piece of silk, her breath catching slightly. "You have good taste," a voice said behind her. Nomsa turned. There stood Sibusiso, his gaze steady, his smile knowing. "This one suits you," he continued, lifting the fabric she had touched. "A woman like you should not wear ordinary things." Nomsa laughed lightly, though there was a trace of bitterness beneath it. "A woman like me wears what her life allows." Sibusiso tilted his head, studying her more closely. "Or perhaps, what she accepts." Those words lingered. From that moment, their conversations became frequent. At first, they were brief, simple greetings, shared glances, passing remarks. But soon they grew longer, deeper. Sibusiso spoke of a world beyond the village, a world of comfort, of status, of ease. He painted pictures with his words, and Nomsa listened. And as the elders say, the ear that drinks sweet lies soon forgets the taste of truth. It did not take long before their meetings moved away from the open market. They began to meet in quieter places, behind shops near the edge of town, where fewer eyes could see. Nomsa told herself it was harmless. Just conversations, just a moment to breathe. But even she knew that something had already crossed a line that could not be unseen. One afternoon, as the sun stood high and unforgiving, Lwazi followed her mother. She had not planned to, but something inside her, the same quiet instinct that had warned her before, pushed her feet forward. She kept her distance, her small frame, moving silently between people and stalls. She watched as Nomsa walked past the usual market paths and continued further than she had ever gone before. Lwazi's heart began to beat faster. Then she saw him, Sibusiso. He stood waiting beneath the shade of a tall tree, his posture relaxed, as if he had all the time in the world. And when Nomsa approached, his face lit up, not with surprise but with expectation, as though he had been waiting for her. Lwazi froze. She watched as her mother smiled, a smile she had not seen at home in a long time. It was soft, almost youthful. And when Sibusiso reached out to touch Nomsa's hand, she did not pull away. The world seemed to fall silent around Lwazi. Her chest tightened. "No," she whispered under her breath, shaking her head as if denial could change what she was seeing. But truth does not disappear simply because we close our eyes to it. She stayed hidden, her small hands trembling as she listened. "You deserve more than that life," Sibusiso was saying, his voice low and persuasive. "You deserve a man who can give you everything." Nomsa did not respond immediately, but she did not walk away. And in that silence, Lwazi understood more than any words could explain. The seed of suspicion in her heart had now grown roots, and with it came a weight far too heavy for a child to carry. For she had seen something no daughter should ever see. And from that moment on, nothing in her home would ever feel the same again. They say the heaviest burden is not the truth itself, but the silence that surrounds it. From that day beneath the tall tree, Lwazi carried a secret that pressed against her chest like a stone. Each time she looked at her father, Themba, she felt it grow heavier. Each time her mother Nomsa smiled, as though nothing had changed, the weight became almost unbearable. At night, when the compound fell quiet and only the distant hum of insects filled the air, Lwazi lay awake on her mat, staring into the darkness. Her thoughts circled endlessly. Should I tell Baba? But then another voice would answer and break his heart. She turned onto her side, pulling the thin cloth over her shoulders, as if it could shield her from the storm inside her mind. In the days that followed, the signs became impossible to ignore. Nomsa's absences grew longer. Her explanations grew shorter. "I had business at the market," she would say, quickly avoiding eye contact. Again, Themba would ask gently, though not accusingly, "You have been going often." Nomsa would shrug, her tone sharp. "Do you expect me to sit here all day, doing nothing?" Themba would fall silent after that. He was not a man who liked conflict. He believed in patience, in trust, and so he chose to believe his wife. But Lwazi saw the cracks. She noticed how her mother hid small wrapped bundles beneath her clothes. She noticed the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume that lingered long after Nomsa entered the house. She noticed the way her mother's laughter had changed. It was no longer warm, but forced, almost rehearsed. And most of all, she noticed how Nomsa looked at Themba, not with love, but with distance. One evening, unable to bear it any longer, Lwazi followed her mother into the small cooking area behind the house. "Mama," she said softly. Nomsa did not turn immediately. She continued stirring the pot, her movements steady, controlled. "What is it?" Lwazi hesitated. Her fingers tightened at her sides. "I saw you," she whispered. The spoon stopped moving. Silence fell thick and heavy. Nomsa slowly turned, her eyes narrowing. "Saw me?" Where? Lwazi swallowed hard. "At the market." "No, beyond the market. With that man." For a brief moment, something flickered across Nomsa's face, shock, fear, but it vanished, just as quickly. "What nonsense are you speaking?" Nomsa said coldly, turning back to the pot. "You are a child. You imagine things. I am not imagining." Lwazi's voice rose, trembling. "He held your hand. You were smiling." "Enough." The word cut through the air like a blade. Nomsa spun around, her expression now hard, unfamiliar. "You will not speak of this again," she said, her voice low but firm. "Do you hear me?" Lwazi stepped back, startled by the sudden intensity. "But Baba, he deserves to know." Nomsa moved closer, her gaze piercing. "And you would destroy your own father with your childish thoughts?" she asked sharply. "You think you are protecting him. You would break him." Lwazi's eyes filled with tears. "I am trying to save him." Nomsa's face softened for just a second, but not with love, with calculation. "Listen to me, Lwazi," she said quietly. "There are things in this world you are too young to understand. Sometimes, silence is the only way to keep a family together." She placed a firm hand on Lwazi's shoulder. "You will say nothing." The weight of those words settled heavily between them. Lwazi looked into her mother's eyes, searching for the warmth she once knew. But it was gone. In its place was something colder, something distant. Fear crept into her heart. Not just fear of the truth she carried, but fear of the person her mother was becoming. That night, Lwazi sat outside beneath the vast African sky, the stars scattered like silent witnesses above her. She wrapped her arms around herself, her thoughts louder than ever. Her mother had chosen silence, but Lwazi could feel it deep within her spirit. Silence was no longer protecting this home. It was slowly destroying it. They say when greed enters through the front door, love quietly slips out through the back. In the days that followed, Lwazi no longer searched for proof, because the truth had already begun to reveal itself without shame. Nomsa was no longer careful. Where once she moved like a shadow, now she walked with a boldness that unsettled the very air of the compound. She dressed differently, wrapping herself in fabrics too fine for their simple life. Bracelets appeared on her wrists, golden gleaming in the sunlight. When asked, she gave the same answer: "I traded for them." But even Themba, gentle as he was, began to pause when she spoke. One evening, as the family sat together eating quietly, Themba's eyes lingered on the bracelet around Nomsa's wrist. "That is a beautiful piece," he said slowly. "I have not seen anything like it in our market." Nomsa did not look up. "Then perhaps you have not been looking closely." Her tone was sharp, too sharp. Themba fell silent, lowering his gaze to his food. Lwazi watched him closely, her chest tightening. She saw the confusion in his eyes, the small crack forming in the trust he had always held so firmly. But still, he said nothing. Because, as the elders say, a man who fears the truth will build his house on questions instead of answers. Lwazi, however, could no longer stand on uncertainty. One afternoon, while her father worked in the fields, she followed her mother again, this time with a purpose, not driven by doubt, but by the need to know how far the betrayal had gone. Nomsa walked quickly, her steps confident as if she no longer feared being seen. Lwazi kept her distance, her heart pounding in her ears. She followed her past the market, past the tree where she had first seen them, and further, to a small house near the edge of town. Lwazi stopped behind a low wall, her breath shallow. The door opened. Sibusiso stepped out. He looked around briefly before smiling as Nomsa approached. This time there was no hesitation between them. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, as though she already belonged to him. Lwazi's stomach twisted. She wanted to turn away, but her feet would not move. She crept closer, careful not to be seen until their voices reached her clearly through the open window. "You worry too much," Sibusiso was saying, his voice smooth. "Soon all of this will be behind you." Nomsa's voice was softer now, almost uncertain. "And my husband, my child," Sibusiso let out a small laugh. "You cannot carry everyone into a new life, Nomsa. Some things must be left behind." There was a pause. A long, heavy pause. Then Nomsa spoke again. "I have started taking money," she admitted quietly. "Small amounts. He has not noticed." Lwazi felt as though the ground beneath her had disappeared. Her hands trembled violently. "No one will question it," Sibusiso replied calmly. "Once you leave, it will not matter. Leave." The word echoed in Lwazi's mind like a drumbeat. Her mother was not just betraying her father. She was planning to abandon them. Tears filled Lwazi's eyes as she stumbled back, her chest tightening with a pain she could not contain. Every memory of her mother, the laughter, the warmth, the gentle hands braiding her hair, collided with the reality before her. It felt like losing someone who was still alive. Back at the compound, as the sun dipped low, Themba returned home tired, but smiling as always. "My daughter," he greeted warmly, placing a hand on Lwazi's shoulder. "You have been quiet today." Lwazi forced a small smile, her heart breaking at the innocence in his voice. "I am fine, Baba," she whispered. But inside, she was screaming, because she now carried a truth far heavier than before. Not only was her mother betraying her father, she was already preparing to erase them from her life. And as Themba sat down, trusting unaware, Lwazi felt the unbearable weight of what she knew pressing down on her soul. For how long could she remain silent, when silence itself had become a betrayal? They say a pot can sit on the fire for a long time, but one day it will boil over. The change in Nomsa could no longer be hidden, not even behind forced smiles or hurried excuses. What once lived in shadows had now begun to show itself in the open, through her tone, her actions, and the quiet disrespect that crept into her words. Themba felt it. Though he could not name it, he felt the shift in his home, like a man who senses rain before the clouds appear. He began to watch his wife more closely, not with suspicion, but with a quiet confusion that weighed heavily on his heart. One evening, as the wind carried dust through the compound, Themba sat repairing an old wooden stool. Nomsa entered, her footsteps firm, her presence distant. "You came home late again," Themba said gently, not looking up. Nomsa sighed, clearly irritated. "I told you I had business." Every day, he asked softly. She crossed her arms. "Do you question everything I do now?" Themba finally looked at her, his eyes searching. "I only ask because I care. This home, it feels different." For a moment, silence lingered between them. Then Nomsa laughed, but it was not a laugh of warmth. "Different," she repeated. "Perhaps you are only now realizing what this life truly is. And what is that, Themba asked. A life of struggle, she snapped. Of always having just enough, but never more. Of watching others live better, while we pretend this is enough. Themba's face fell slightly, though he remained calm. We have peace, Nomsa, he said quietly. Many would envy that. Peace does not fill empty hands, she replied sharply. Lwazi stood nearby, hidden just beyond the doorway, her heart pounding as she listened. Every word felt like a crack, spreading through the walls of her home. This was no longer the mother she knew. This was someone else. That night, Lwazi could not sleep. Her father's silence haunted her. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. And deep within her chest, something began to rise, something stronger than fear. It was clarity. She stepped outside the cool night air, brushing against her skin. Above her, the sky stretched endlessly, filled with stars that seemed to watch over the earth in silence. Ancestors, she whispered, her voice trembling, what should I do? The wind answered only with stillness. But within her heart, she already knew. The following day, the village gathered. It was a celebration, one of those rare moments when laughter returned to every corner of the compound. Women prepared food, children ran freely, and elders sat beneath the shade, sharing stories of old. Themba stood among them, smiling, greeting neighbors, unaware that the foundation beneath his feet was already cracking. Nomsa arrived later than expected. When she entered, heads turned not in admiration, but in quiet curiosity. Her appearance was striking, almost out of place. The fabric she wore shimmered in the sunlight, richer than anything the village was used to seeing. Lwazi noticed the whispers. She noticed the looks. And she knew. The truth was already beginning to surface, even without her voice. Her hands trembled at her sides as she watched her parents from across the gathering. This was the moment she had feared, the moment she had tried to delay. Her heart pounded so loudly, she thought others might hear it. If I speak, everything will change. But then she looked at her father, at the man who had given everything without question, at the man who still smiled, still trusted, still believed. And in that instant, Lwazi understood something. The elders often said, silence in the face of wrong is not peace, it is permission. She took a step forward, then another. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself was trying to hold her back. Her breath shook, her voice hid somewhere deep within her chest. But her spirit refused to remain silent any longer. For some truths are not meant to stay buried, and some voices, no matter how small, are meant to be heard. They say when truth rises in a gathering, even the drums fall silent to listen. The laughter that once filled the compound began to fade as Lwazi stepped forward, her small figure cutting through the crowd like a quiet storm. Conversations slowed, eyes turned. Even the elders seated beneath the shade leaned in slightly, as if they could feel that something sacred and dangerous was about to unfold. Themba noticed first. My daughter, he called gently, a hint of concern in his voice. What is it? Lwazi stopped in the center of the gathering, her chest rising and falling rapidly. For a moment, the world blurred around her. Faces became shadows, voices disappeared. All that remained was the truth. She turned to face her father. Baba, her voice trembled barely above a whisper. Then stronger, steadier. There is something you must know. A murmur spread through the crowd. Nomsa stiffened. Lwazi, she said sharply, her tone low but firm, this is not the place. But Lwazi did not move. This time she did not look away. It is the only place left, she replied. The air shifted. Themba stood slowly, confusion clouding his face. What are you saying, my child? Lwazi's hands shook, but her eyes remained fixed on him. Mama has been meeting another man, she said. The words fell like stones. Gasps erupted around the compound. Women covered their mouths. Men exchanged glances. The elders, straightened their expressions, turning grave. Themba did not react immediately, as though his mind refused to understand what his ears had heard. Nomsa stepped forward, her face burning with anger. "This is a lie," she snapped. "A child's imagination. You would stand here and shame your own mother." Lwazi swallowed hard tears, welling in her eyes. "I saw you, many times, at the market, beyond it, with Sibusiso." At the mention of that name, a ripple passed through the crowd. Nomsa's composure faltered just for a second, but she quickly recovered. "You are confused," she said coldly. "You do not understand what you think you saw." "I understand enough," Lwazi replied, her voice breaking. "You are leaving us. You are taking Baba's money. Enough." Nomsa's voice cracked through the air. Themba raised a trembling hand. "Nomsa," he said quietly, his voice heavy, with something deeper than anger, something closer to pain. "Is this true?" Silence. A long, unbearable silence. Nomsa opened her mouth, but before she could speak, a voice came from the edge of the crowd. "Well, it seems the child has spoken before we could." All heads turned. Sibusiso stepped forward. He walked with the same confidence as always, his presence cutting through the tension like a blade. But this time there was no charm in his smile, only cold detachment. Nomsa's eyes widened. "What are you doing here?" Sibusiso shrugged lightly. "I was invited. Business with one of the elders." He glanced around amused. "But it seems I arrived at a more interesting moment." Themba's gaze darkened as he looked at the man before him. "This is the man?" he asked quietly. Lwazi nodded, unable to speak. Nomsa stepped toward Sibusiso, her voice urgent. "Say something. Tell them." Sibusiso laughed. Not kindly, not gently, but with the careless amusement of a man who had nothing to lose. "Tell them what," he interrupted. "That we have been seeing each other, that she comes to me willingly." He tilted his head, studying Nomsa. "Or should I tell them the part where you believed I would take you as my wife?" A stunned silence fell. Nomsa's face drained of color. "You said I said many things," Sibusiso cut in smoothly. "That is how persuasion works." A murmur of disapproval rose from the crowd. One of the elders shook his head slowly. "A man who builds with lies will watch it collapse on his own head." Nomsa turned desperately to Sibusiso. "You promised me a life, a future." Sibusiso's expression hardened. "I already have a wife," he said plainly, "and children. Did you truly believe you were special?" The words struck like thunder. Nomsa staggered back as if physically hit. The illusion she had built shattered in an instant. Around her, the crowd watched, not with sympathy, but with the quiet judgment reserved for those who betray their own. Themba stood still, his face pale, his eyes filled with a pain too deep for words. He looked at Nomsa not with anger, but with something far worse. Disappointment. "You traded your home," he said slowly, "for a promise that was never yours." Nomsa's lips trembled, but no words came. Lwazi stood, frozen tears streaming down her face. She had spoken the truth, but truth had come with a cost. For in exposing the darkness, she had watched her entire world break apart before her eyes. They say when a tree falls in the village, it does not fall alone, it shakes the ground for everything around it. In the days after the gathering, the compound that once echoed with laughter grew quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of contentment, but the heavy silence of something broken beyond easy repair. Nomsa no longer walked with pride. Where once she moved like a queen among the women of the village, now she kept her eyes, lowered her steps uncertain. The same people who had once admired her beauty now watched her with a different gaze, one not of cruelty but of consequence. For as the elders often say, the world does not punish loudly, it simply withdraws its respect. No one chased her away. No one shouted. But the greetings grew shorter. The smiles disappeared. And the space around her slowly widened until she stood alone, even in the presence of others. Inside the compound, the change was even deeper. Themba became quieter. He still rose early, still worked the fields, still carried himself with dignity, but the light in his eyes had dimmed. Trust once broken does not shatter like glass, it erodes like stone, slowly, painfully. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted long shadows across the yard, Lwazi found him sitting alone. "Baba," she said softly. Themba looked up, his expression gentle, despite the weight he carried. "Come, my child." She sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I am sorry," she whispered. Themba studied her for a long moment, then shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "Do not carry a burden that is not yours." "But I broke our family." Themba placed a firm, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Our family was already breaking," he replied. "You only brought the truth into the light." Lwazi's eyes filled with tears. "It hurts." "Yes," Themba said, his voice steady. "Truth often does." He looked out toward the horizon, where the last light of day lingered. "But pain is not always destruction," he continued. "Sometimes it is the beginning of healing." Not far from them, Nomsa stood in the shadows listening. Her heart twisted with every word. For the first time, she saw clearly what she had done, not through her own eyes, but through the silence she had created. She had chased a life built on illusion, and in doing so, she had lost the one built on love. Later that night, Nomsa approached, slowly, her steps hesitant. "Themba," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He did not turn immediately. "I was wrong," she said, the words trembling as they left her lips. "I let pride blind me. I let greed speak louder than my heart." Themba remained still. "I thought I deserved more," she continued, tears now falling freely. "But I see now, I had everything." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Themba spoke. "Regret comes easily when the cost has been paid," he said calmly. "But understanding, that is what matters." Nomsa lowered her head, unable to meet his gaze. "I do not ask for forgiveness," she said. "Only a chance to make things right, if that is still possible." Themba exhaled slowly. "Some things can be rebuilt," he said, "but they will never be the same." Nomsa nodded, accepting the truth in his words. And Lwazi, standing quietly nearby, watched as her parents faced the fragile beginning of something new, not the same home they once had, but perhaps a wiser one. For in every village there is a story like this. A story of pride that grew too strong, of greed that whispered sweet lies, of betrayal that nearly destroyed everything, but also a story of truth, of courage, of a child who chose to speak when silence would have been easier. And as the elders say, a home built on lies cannot survive the voice of truth. But a home rebuilt on truth can stand stronger than before. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories like this.